The John F. Kennedy International Airport Departure Lounge was a cathedral of cold indifference, a place built of grey marble, gleaming chrome, and vast panes of glass that reflected the hurried, isolated movements of its temporary inhabitants. Business travelers, encased in expensive suits, moved with a calculated urgency, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of their smartphones. It was an environment designed for efficiency, not connection, where the air hummed with the low thrum of air conditioning and the silent pressure of schedules. Amidst this sea of self-absorbed individuals, wealth was a visible but sterile force, creating a profound sense of loneliness that was almost palpable. The sleek, modern design of the space only served to amplify the human disconnection, making each person an island in a meticulously curated archipelago of transit. Eleanor Caldwell, at 75, felt entirely out of place. Her silver hair was elegantly styled, and her classic coat spoke of a life of quiet refinement, but her blue eyes, though still holding a resilient flicker of hope, seemed lost in the airport's overwhelming chaos. She clutched her handbag tightly, her gloved hands trembling almost imperceptibly as she tried to decipher the rapidly changing information on the departure screen. A widow for several years, she was accustomed to a certain loneliness, but here, surrounded by so many people yet utterly invisible, it felt more acute. The emotional distance of her only son, Ethan, had prepared her for this feeling, yet it never ceased to ache. She was a ghost of a bygone era, navigating a world that moved too fast and cared too little. The sudden announcement of a gate change sent a ripple of organized panic through the crowd. In the ensuing shuffle, Eleanor, momentarily disoriented, fumbled with her travel wallet. Her boarding pass, along with a small, worn photograph of her late husband and a silver locket, slipped from her grasp and scattered across the polished floor. A man in a tailored suit nearly crushed the photo with his briefcase, sidestepping at the last second without a glance. Another woman, her attention fixed on a phone call, walked right over the boarding pass. For a few long seconds, Eleanor stood frozen, a statue of quiet distress as the river of people flowed around her, completely oblivious to her struggle. The items at her feet were not just possessions, they were fragments of her life, ignored and insignificant on the cold, hard ground. Then, a gentle hand touched her arm. A young woman with an easy smile and warm, attentive eyes knelt to gather the scattered items. Her name was Laura Miller, and her movements were unhurried and kind. A stark contrast to the frantic energy surrounding them. She carefully picked up the photograph, wiping a smudge from its surface with her thumb, before handing it back to Eleanor with a reassuring look. "It's easy to get turned around in here," Laura said softly, her voice a small pocket of warmth in the sterile air. She then glanced at Eleanor's boarding pass and pointed toward the correct gate. "We're heading the same way." Eleanor, her heart swelling with a gratitude so profound it left her speechless, could only nod. By a simple twist of fate, their assigned seats on Flight 734 were right next to each other. As the aircraft ascended, leaving the sprawling geometry of New York City behind, a quiet intimacy settled between Eleanor and Laura. The impersonal hum of the engines created a cocoon, insulating them from the world they had just left. For the first time that day, Eleanor felt her shoulders relax. The frantic energy of the airport dissolved, replaced by the gentle kindness radiating from the young woman beside her. They spoke of small things at first, the cities they were leaving, and the destinations they sought. Laura listened with an attentiveness that was both rare and deeply comforting, her gaze never straying to a phone or a magazine. In her presence, Eleanor felt seen, not as an elderly woman fumbling with her belongings, but as a person with a story worth hearing, a feeling she hadn't realized she was so starved for. Eleanor found herself opening up in ways she hadn't in years, sharing anecdotes of her late husband, a man whose laughter still echoed in the quiet corners of her home. She spoke of his passion for woodworking, the way his hands could turn a simple block of wood into something beautiful and full of life. She also spoke of her son, Ethan, her voice softening with a mixture of immense pride and a deep, unspoken sorrow. She described his success, the empire he commanded, but her words were tinged with the loneliness of a mother who saw her child encased in a fortress of his own making. Laura absorbed it all, not with pity, but with a profound and gentle empathy, offering a quiet understanding that felt like a warm blanket on a cold day. The conversation drifted to their family histories, and with a casualness that belied the weight of the name, Eleanor mentioned her husband's family name was Caldwell. Laura's eyes widened in genuine surprise, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. She explained that her own grandfather, a master craftsman and artisan, had once been the closest friend and business partner of a man named Caldwell. They had built a small furniture company together from the ground up, their shared dream forged in a dusty workshop. But their story had ended abruptly, shrouded in a mysterious falling out that shattered their friendship and their business, leaving a legacy of unanswered questions and quiet resentment that had trickled down through her family for decades. The air between them suddenly crackled with the energy of a shared, forgotten history. A powerful, audacious hope bloomed in Eleanor's chest, a feeling so potent it almost took her breath away. In Laura, she saw not just a kind stranger, but a living embodiment of the warmth and humanity that had been systematically erased from her family's legacy and, more importantly, from her son's heart. She saw the ghost of a friendship that deserved to be honored, a wrong that might, in some small way, be righted. On an impulse driven by a mother's desperate love, she extended an invitation. She asked Laura to join her for dinner at her home, framing it as a way to honor the memory of their grandfathers. But her true intention was far more ambitious, to reintroduce Ethan to a world where kindness was not a weakness and connection was not a transaction. Ethan received his mother's phone call in his penthouse office, a sterile space of glass and steel overlooking the city. The request was, to him, utterly baffling and deeply irritating. His schedule was a meticulously calibrated machine, with no room for sentimental dinners with complete strangers. The name Miller struck a dissonant chord deep within him, dredging up the vague but potent narrative his father had drilled into him since childhood. The Millers were a symbol of betrayal, the architects of his family's first great crisis. His father had spoken of them with a cold, unforgiving bitterness, painting them as opportunists who had nearly destroyed everything his grandfather had built. The story was a foundational myth of the Caldwell Empire, a cautionary tale about the perils of trust and the necessity of ruthless self-reliance. He paced his office, the city lights a glittering, impersonal carpet below. His father's lessons were the very architecture of his mind. Vulnerability is a fatal flaw. Emotion is a liability. Net worth is the only reliable metric of a man's value. These principles had guided him to immense success, but they had also built the walls of his gilded cage. To invite a Miller into his life felt like a betrayal of his father's memory, a willful act of naivete. He wrestled with the request, torn between his ingrained suspicion and a flicker of curiosity he couldn't extinguish. Something about his mother's insistence, her uncharacteristic hopefulness, gnawed at the edges of his certainty, challenging the cold logic that had governed his entire adult life. The dinner was a study in contrasts. Eleanor's home was warm and inviting, filled with the scent of roasted chicken and the soft glow of lamplight on old photographs. It was a space that spoke of love and lived history, a stark counterpoint to the cold, calculated atmosphere Ethan brought with him. He was impeccably dressed, his mannerisms polished, but his presence felt like a block of ice in the center of the room. He greeted Laura with a handshake that was firm but brief, his eyes scanning her with an appraising, distant curiosity. From the moment she walked in, Laura could feel the invisible wall he had erected, a barrier of polite suspicion that made the air thick with unspoken tension. Eleanor's hopeful expression began to waver, replaced by a quiet anxiety. Throughout the meal, Ethan's questions were relentless, disguised as casual conversation but structured like a corporate interrogation. He inquired about her career, her ambitions, her family's financial history. Each question a carefully aimed probe, designed to unearth what he believed were her true intentions. Laura answered with a calm, unwavering grace, refusing to be intimidated. She spoke of her work with non-profits, her passion for community art projects, and the simple life she cherished. She met his suspicion not with defensiveness, but with an open-hearted sincerity that seemed to baffle him. Eleanor sat between them, a silent observer to a battle of worldviews, her dream of connection slowly souring into an evening of polite, soul-crushing conflict. The breaking point came when Ethan, with a veneer of detached curiosity, brought up their grandfathers. He steered the conversation toward the old company, subtly framing the narrative around the unfortunate decisions that led to its downfall, his phrasing carefully placing the blame at the feet of Laura's family. A quiet fire ignited in Laura's eyes. She put down her fork and looked directly at him, her voice steady but laced with the weight of generational pride. She spoke of her grandfather not as a failed businessman, but as a man of integrity, a brilliant artisan whose honor was his most prized possession. She didn't raise her voice, but her conviction was absolute, creating an emotional stalemate that silenced the table. The dinner ended shortly after, the air thick with all that had been said and everything that remained unspoken. It's a heavy burden, isn't it, when the stories we inherit keep us from the people we might love. If these kinds of struggles resonate with you, subscribing to the channel helps us continue to bring them to light. In the days that followed, Ethan's world rushed to reinforce his prejudices. He mentioned the dinner to a close business partner who scoffed at the story. And a non-profit worker with a family grudge? Classic gold digger, Ethan. Be careful, the friend had warned, his words echoing the cynical worldview Ethan himself had long championed. This external validation should have been comforting, a confirmation that his instincts were correct. It should have allowed him to dismiss Laura as a calculated threat and move on. Yet, instead of relief, he felt a persistent, unsettling disquiet. The narrative felt too neat, too simple. The logic was sound, but the memory of Laura's unwavering gaze as she defended her grandfather's honor didn't fit into the clean lines of the story he'd been told. He found himself alone in his vast apartment, the silence amplifying the conflict raging within him. He replayed the dinner over and over, his father's harsh warnings clashing with his mother's desperate, hopeful face. For the first time, the foundation of his belief system felt unstable. He had built his life on the bedrock of his father's truth, a truth that had protected him, guided him, and isolated him. Now, a single conversation with a stranger threatened to shatter it all. The certainty that had been his armor for so long was beginning to feel like a cage, and a terrifying thought began to surface. What if his father was wrong? Have you ever felt that gnawing feeling that a truth you've lived by might be a lie? It's a terrifying and powerful moment. Sharing these stories is only possible with your support, so please consider subscribing. The internal battle became unbearable. He needed more than the second-hand story that had defined his family for 2 generations. He needed proof. His mind turned to his father's old study, a room he had kept locked and untouched since his death, a perfect museum of the man he had tried so hard to emulate. And inside that study, behind a portrait of his grandfather, was an old wall safe. He had never known the combination, but his mother did. He didn't know what he was looking for, perhaps old financial records or business correspondence. He only knew that he could no longer live with the ghost of a doubt. With a deep breath that felt like both a betrayal and a liberation, he walked out of his apartment, a singular purpose driving him toward his mother's house and the secrets locked away in the past. Eleanor met him at the door of her home, her eyes full of a cautious hope as she led him to the study. The room was a time capsule, smelling faintly of old paper and wood polish, a shrine to a man Ethan had only ever known as an icon of unyielding strength. He watched as his mother's trembling fingers dialed the combination into the old wall safe, a sequence of numbers she had kept secret for decades. The heavy steel door swung open with a deep groan, revealing a small, dark space that held the ghosts of his family's past. For a moment, Ethan just stared into the void, the cold air from within washing over him. Reaching inside felt like a transgression, a violation of his father's most sacred law. Never look back, never doubt. But the memory of Laura's quiet dignity was stronger than a lifetime of indoctrination, and he pushed his hand into the darkness. His fingers brushed against a worn, leather-bound journal and a single, thick envelope, its paper yellowed with age. He took them to his father's mahogany desk, the silence of the room pressing in on him. He opened the envelope first. The letter inside was written in his grandfather's elegant, looping script. The ink faded to a soft brown. As his eyes scanned the first few lines, his breath caught in his chest. The carefully constructed reality of his entire life began to fracture. It wasn't a business document. It was a confession, a raw, painful account of a man's pride and the devastating consequences of his shame. Every word was a hammer blow against the foundation of his identity, dismantling the myth of the Caldwell Empire and the story of the Miller betrayal piece by agonizing piece, revealing the hollow truth that lay beneath. The letter detailed a catastrophic investment his grandfather had made, a reckless gamble against the stern and prescient advice of his partner, Laura's grandfather. The company had nearly collapsed, not because of betrayal, but because of his own hubris. To save his reputation and salvage his pride, he had created a lie. He had scapegoated his closest friend, poisoning his own son with a narrative of victimhood and resentment that had been passed down to Ethan like a cursed inheritance. Ethan dropped the letter as if it had burned his hands, a wave of nausea washing over him. His father hadn't been a stoic survivor. He had been the vessel of a decades-old lie. Have you ever felt that gnawing feeling that a truth you've lived by might be a lie? It's a terrifying and powerful moment. Sharing these stories is only possible with your support, so please consider subscribing. He didn't say goodbye to his mother. He grabbed the letter and sprinted from the house, his mind a chaotic storm of anger, grief, and a profound, soul-crushing shame. He drove through the city, the glittering skyline that had always been a symbol of his power now feeling like a monument to a falsehood. He didn't know Laura's exact address, but he knew the neighborhood she had mentioned, a quiet, unassuming part of the city worlds away from his own. He found her building, a modest brick structure with potted plants on the fire escapes, a place that radiated a warmth and authenticity his penthouse could never possess. He sat in his car for a long moment, the letter a lead weight in his hand. He was about to destroy his family's legacy in order to save his own soul, and he was terrified. When Laura opened the door, her welcoming smile faded into a look of deep concern. Ethan stood before her, not as a titan of industry, but as a broken man. His suit was rumpled, his hair was a mess, and his eyes were red-rimmed and pleading. "I need to read you something," he managed to say, his voice hoarse and unfamiliar to his own ears. She led him into her small, art-filled apartment, and he sank onto her sofa. With hands that shook uncontrollably, he unfolded the yellowed paper and began to read his grandfather's words aloud. His voice cracked on the confession of guilt, on the expression of deep regret, and on the name of the friend he had wronged. When he finished, he finally looked up at her, the letter falling from his lap. For the first time in his life, his eyes were filled with tears, his emotional armor shattered into a million pieces on her living room floor. Laura did not react with triumph, nor with the cold satisfaction of vindication. She simply watched him, her small apartment a sanctuary of quiet empathy as the weight of his family's history finally broke him. When his voice faded and the silence in the room became absolute, she didn't offer platitudes or judgments. Instead, she reached out and placed a gentle hand on his, a simple, grounding gesture that communicated more than words ever could. In her warm, steady gaze, he saw not the descendant of a rival, but a person offering a lifeline. It was here, surrounded by canvases and clay pots, that the armor Ethan had worn his entire life finally fell away, not shattered by an enemy, but dissolved by an act of profound, unconditional grace. The healing began in that moment, with the quiet acknowledgement of a shared, painful past, and the silent promise that he was no longer alone in carrying its burden. The confession was not an end, but a beginning. Freed from the corrosive weight of a generational lie, Ethan's mind, once laser-focused on profit margins and market dominance, now saw a different kind of opportunity, a chance to build something that truly mattered. A few weeks later, he approached Laura, not with another apology, but with a detailed proposal. He wanted to establish the Caldwell and Miller Foundation, an organization dedicated to funding and mentoring young artists and artisans, a living tribute to the talent and integrity of the man his family had so grievously wronged. It was a monumental act of public reconciliation, redirecting the cold capital of his empire toward fostering the very creativity and humanity his father had taught him to suppress. For the first time, the Caldwell name would be attached not to ruthless acquisition, but to restoration and hope. Their work on the foundation forged a bond deeper than either could have anticipated. In planning galleries, reviewing applications, and celebrating the successes of their first scholarship recipients, they were not just building a non-profit, they were rebuilding a history, weaving their two family stories into a single, beautiful tapestry. The suspicion in Ethan's eyes was replaced by a deep admiration for Laura's passion, and her initial wariness of him melted into an affection for the kind, vulnerable man he was becoming. They fell in love not in a whirlwind of romance, but in the quiet, steady work of making things right. Eleanor watched this transformation with a heart so full of peace she thought it might burst. She saw her son laugh freely, hold a hand without hesitation, and look at his future not as a fortress to be defended, but as a home to be shared. Ethan learned that the greatest legacy isn't built from steel and glass, but from the bridges you construct over the chasms of the past. His company found a new soul, integrating social responsibility into its core mission, proving that empathy was not a liability, but the ultimate asset. He and Laura, now partners in every sense of the word, often found themselves at the airport, not as hurried, isolated travelers, but as people watching the world with open hearts, ever mindful of the stranger in need of a helping hand. The truth had not destroyed his family, it had liberated them, creating a future far richer than any balance sheet could ever show. It's incredible how one story of healing can ripple outwards, isn't it? If you believe in the power of these transformations and want to help us share more, please subscribe to the channel. Your support makes it all possible.